All right, let's move on. Our fourth speaker is Mr. David Traylor, Senior Managing Director. His topic, getting out of the weeds, leveraging star power, media assets, and strategic partnerships in cannabis. Mr. David Traylor is a senior managing director at Gold Eagle Partners, a firm he founded in 2012 to advise life sciences companies. He soon took an interest in the then emerging cannabis sector and started advising cannabis companies in 2013. In 2014, he joined Cerna Inc., OPC SRNA is the symbol, as Chief Business Officer. After a year at Cerna, Mr. Traylor refounded Golden Eagle Partner to provide his knowledge to companies across the cannabis sector. Before Golden Eagle Partners, Mr. Traylor served at leading investment banking firms, including Pacific Growth Equities, Tireless and Company, and Headwaters MB. During his banking tenures, he has advised private and public biotechnology and medical device companies, helping to structure transactions, including IPOs, that's initial public offerings, public offerings, private offerings, mergers, acquisitions totaling over 500 million in value. And before investment banking, Mr. Traylor spent 15 years in senior operational roles for biotechnology companies, including research and development, business development, manufacturing, and program management. And by the way, here's my favorite part of his resume. In 1988, Mr. Traylor was one of the 5 Colorado players selected to play for the Denver Rifles in the American Lacrosse League, ALL, the first U.S. professional lacrosse league. Sorry, forgive me, Professional Field Lacrosse League. I played lacrosse in high school, and it was a lot of fun. I give you credit for that. Mr. Traylor parlays his athletic background and knowledge in cannabis to assist Athletes for Care, a not-for-profit created by athletes to address healthcare issues. They do good work. You should Google them. David received a BA degree from the University of Colorado, Boulder in biochemistry, a BA degree in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology, and an MBA from the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He is also the listed inventor of free issued US patents, and now that's impressive. Mr. Traylor is a registered representative and has passed the FINRA Series 7, 63, and 66 examinations. And Mr. Traylor is registered in the following states: California, Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Illinois, Massachusetts, Nevada, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Puerto Rico, Texas, and Washington. If I've missed anything or misstated anything, David, please correct it. And Mr. David Taylor, please take it away.
Hey, thank you, John. Really appreciate it. And actually, I think you just pretty much did the whole comment on everything. So we can just open it up for questions, John. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. If you have anything you want to say, just go ahead.
Thank you for the kind introduction, John. Thanks, Brad, for organizing this. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here with all these other panelists, esteemed panelists, and certainly thanks everybody for listening in. Really, I was talking to Brad. One of the topic that Brad had put out is talking about cannabis and registered FINRA broker dealers, and I thought that would probably be a topic that wouldn't be so interesting. But I think a couple topics maybe I'd like to do is some of the things we've learned, but starting off with maybe the evolution of what we've seen in finance in cannabis, and maybe also thanks, John, for kind of setting the table on that, but adding a little more detail or color to some of that background, because it has been, frankly speaking, I think most people that are in the cannabis industry, like Dr. David. Nice job, Dr. David, is finding out how people actually originally got into the industry and go from there. But I would like to take it way back, kind of, I think, in the beginning, and to what John had just indicated. Frankly, I think everybody on this listening in would say it's better to be lucky than good. And so, frankly, looking back on my career, I got pretty lucky with a lot of things, and certainly one of them was getting into cannabis when we did. So again, I'm Senior Managing Director, Golden Eagle Partners. We're an investment banking firm. We're the first investment banking firm to get into the industry in the US. I'm not so sure that's true for Canada, just because the FINRA requirements scared a number of people away. But before I got registered, as John had indicated, I did some work in leading biotech companies. And so I started off in some companies in Boulder. One thing too, I worked for 15 years for companies based in Boulder, Silicon Valley, and also Berlin, Germany. So there's an international component that I'd like to get to too, because we're based here in Denver, Colorado, but we do international work in the cannabis industry, and we have been doing international work for almost 5 years. But one of the things that was interesting, looking back in my career, is the first 4 years was spent doing recombinant protein production and process development, as John indicated. And luckily, through some of that work, I was awarded inventorship on 2 US patents. And one thing that we learned during that, and also subsequently at a company called Affymetrix, which was a leading genomics company in the mid-1995, 97, mid-90s, learned that biological supply chains are inherently unstable. And by that, I mean, for example, we would be scaling up from 500 liter to 1,000 liters. And all of a sudden we'd have this protein impurity come out of nowhere, and we'd have to find a way to get rid of it. And so as a result of that, when I got into cannabis, I thought it was very interesting, because you'd end up having a lot of these operators, whether they're LPs in Canada or MSOs in the US, going from 40,000 square feet of grow to 400,000 in one jump. And we understood right away that that was a disaster waiting to happen. And frankly, I think you've seen that writ pretty large with a lot of these MSOs in the US going for land grabs and grabbing a lot of cultivation operations. And everybody was thinking that growing weed's easy. And as everybody knows, the end of that story has been told, that growing weed's not easy, and scaling that rapidly is a disaster waiting to happen. You don't see Roche, Genentech, et cetera, do that. But so got into biotech. So that was a really interesting part too, because the one thing, a lesson that we've learned too, and this is kind of the topic of my discussion, is kind of lessons learned in cannabis over the last 7 or so years in finance. And one of them too is the fact that it's a very tough thing to be doing finance and doing cannabis at the same time, right? And that's one thing that Dr. Dave was talking about. He's right, it ain't right, because one thing that has been tough is the cannabis industry, even in spite of the growth that he referenced, it's been an undercapitalized industry, right? And part of that reason has been a number of things. But for example, when I was at Cerna, as John mentioned, I was chief business officer from 2014 to 2015. And that was really one of the first waves. I joined Cerna late in 2014. They went public in March of 2014. They were one of the first companies to be public, along with TerraTech. I think TerraTech was right in front of us. But it was interesting because when I was there, we had a hard time raising $3.5 million for Cerna, being a public company. And now you see, obviously, some of the companies, Curaleaf, raising 300 million these days. So at that early stage, it was really not easy. But also the thing that was interesting about it is that if you're in a cannabis company and if you're an OTC company, it was kind of a perfect storm, frankly. And we were a lightning rod for a crap, to put it bluntly, because OTC companies, a lot of people think that people working at OTC aren't smart. And a lot of people on this call will understand and appreciate the fact that a lot of people think if you work in cannabis, you're not that smart. And so we had numerous times where people would approach us. And so that's the other lesson learned that we've learned in cannabis is you have to be very careful with people say that they have money, because if they do, most likely the time it's not real money, or they're going to move the goalposts on you, et cetera, right? So, but a corollary to that, being at CERNA, I think as some of you guys may remember too, in March 2016, Mass Roots, another problem with the finance and the cannabis side is that, for example, NASDAQ is still a problem here in the US. As many know, Kronos is listed, the Canadian LP on the NASDAQ, because they're not nationally illegal here, they're in Canada, right? But as many of you may remember, Mass Roots, which is a social media company, wasn't even plan touching, tried to list on the NASDAQ in, I think it was May 2016. They were denied by NASDAQ. So, this kind of gets to the fact that a lot of people say, oh, well, cannabis is just like any other industry. And it's not. And especially if you want to talk, for example, whether we're talking marijuana or hemp, it's not the same, because, for example, here in Colorado, as many of you may have seen years ago, and it's still somewhat the case, is in a normal industry, if you have a surplus of some kind of product you make, you can certainly just ship it across the state line and sell it somewhere else. Well, here in Colorado, it's really interesting because you'd see a whipsaw in a lot of different, you'd see a whipsaw in the prices of marijuana here in Colorado, just because you'd see like online outdoor grow operations come online and then flood the market. And so that was still somewhat the case of seeing some really interesting supply and demand economics you don't see very often. And then, for example, with hemp, that's not the same either. So as many of you know, the Farm Bill passed in 2018, December 2018, to legalize hemp, right? And I guess it made it nationally legal, but it turns out one of our clients, Panacea Life Sciences, was based here, and many of you may remember this story. Just a month later, in January 2019, Panacea had ordered a load of hemp from Kentucky, and they're having it shipped to Colorado to process. And it turns out the guys driving the truck unfortunately ran a stoplight. Cops pulled him over in Oklahoma and thought that that was the biggest drug bust they'd ever seen, right? And they were even talking about throwing the drivers in jail for quite a while, right? Well, it turns out that that company didn't see that weed for over a year. For like 15 months did they get that. And I think that's an interesting lesson too for people. Fast forward to now, that people are talking about the SAFE Act, making everything copacetic and descheduling or rescheduling marijuana down to a Schedule 3 or what have you. We firmly believe that even if that happens, they're going to screw it up, right? So take, for example, the 2018 Farm Bill. Even though they supposedly made hemp nationally legal, there's still people in Oklahoma, there's still people in other parts of the US that are not ascribing to that or didn't get the memo, frankly, right? And so then let's add that to marijuana, or if people want to call it cannabis. With a biological background, I look at cannabis as a genus. And so I consider both marijuana and hemp to be underneath cannabis. But that being said, if you look at the cannabis industry, it's interesting because it spans more governmental agencies than probably any other product or sector out there, right? You've got the IRS, you've got the FDA, the DEA, the Treasury, Fed, you name it, right? With all the money and et cetera, the USDA, right? If you're talking hemp. So if they're going to pass some laws, our expectation is they're going to screw it up, right? So even if they do roll back things, we're taking the 2018 Farm Bill as an example of the fact that it's not going to be black and white when things do roll back, and whether that's going to be this year, next year, what have you. For example, we were in a board meeting this week, and one of our clients was stating that their strategy this year was to go public, assuming that the government and the politicians got on the right board and approved that. And essentially, I piped up and essentially said, in any industry, whether it's cannabis or not, I don't think anybody would want to essentially define a strategy dependent on what they believe politicians are going to do. So that's a really interesting point that we wanted to bring up. But as far as the finance, and Brad has wanted me to talk some of this, is that it's been an interesting evolution over time. A couple more things I wanted to say, and I have about, I guess, 7 more minutes, is certainly the financial evolution is continuing to happen. Grassroots still can't list on the NASDAQ or anything. We're seeing more interest, especially internationally. We're seeing more interest in the marijuana sector due to the fact that they see things kind of thawing. They do see a light at the end of the tunnel. So the finance is changing. We were in Dubai in March 2018, ahead of the curve to reach out to, some Saudis and Emiratis about what they might be interested in medical. One person said, well, if I could do it without Sharia law, I'd put half of my portfolio into the sector. And a much older person said, medical cannabis, I don't care if it's medical marijuana, is definitely just a bridge too far. But what we found too is we reach out globally, as I mentioned, to investors. And it's interesting too, because one of the points I want to make on the finance side is that we reach out to a group out of Kazakhstan about 3 years ago. And they essentially said, there's no way in hell's or God's green earth that we're gonna invest in that sector. And sure enough, we call them 6-9 months later, and they've made 3 investments. So that's one of the other lessons learned in the cannabis sector over time, that we've realized that we need to have a CRM. Being investment bankers, the industry, as I mentioned, is undercapitalized. So we're always on the lookout for really good capital from around the world. And we found, being in cannabis, just because somebody says one thing one day doesn't mean you shouldn't talk to them about 6 months down the road and get a completely different answer, right? So that's happened numerous times. One other couple of points that I thought that would be interesting to make. So one of the things I don't think John mentioned is to get the Panacea transaction done in December 2019 as a $24 million tranche deal. And then actually just a year and a half before that, we helped PharmaCann, which was the Illinois MSO, raise $30 million before MedMen tried to buy them out. So we've been part of some of the biggest private placements in the industry, both marijuana and hemp. So we do both. We do plant touching, not plant touching. But we, after that transaction with Panacea, we were lucky enough to go and sponsor both events in Davos during the World Economic Forum in January 2020, right before the pandemic. And so, and one of our we got in front of a number of people, and the whole idea from my talk was to come up with a few ideas that we thought that we've learned in the US that might be applicable to, other countries as they're coming online. And a couple of things I thought were pertinent is, one is that we've seen very little first mover advantage in the industry. And for example, Cerna, for those of you in the industry at the time, Cerna was the top company, or certainly one of the top companies in the industry. When we'd have a big event, and this is when, you'd have the MJ Biz Las Vegas event at the Rio, or you'd have the big NCIA event July of that year in Denver. Cerna always had, or usually had, the biggest booth on the floor. Well, Cerna's really nowhere to be found. They're still a public company. They still exist, but they're not where they were positioned in the industry. Dixie Elixir, as many of you know, they were a top company back in 2015, 2016. They're certainly not in the position on the pedestal they used to be. And then let's bring up MedMen, right? Just about 3-4 years ago, MedMen was one of the king leaders in the industry. And again, we had a conversation with somebody today, and it sounds like pretty much a lot of the assets MedMen is selling off because they've kind of frankly run that company into the ground. So that's, I think, an interesting lesson. Another one that we thought is applicable, and I think it's become true, is the fact that if you look at most of the geographies, and that's how we state it, because we work internationally, but most of what we've seen, the state's rollouts or the rollout of a geography, a new country or new state, is never as fast, or rarely is as fast as people think it's going to be. For example, for us, our perspective, Colorado and rec, Nevada rec, Michigan, Oklahoma, those are good examples of pretty quick rollouts. But let's take Florida, let's take Massachusetts. Frankly, the California rollout was a shit show. And then you look at Portugal, Germany, UK, right? Spain. I mean, really, I don't think any of those countries had a rollout as quickly as they expected. And certainly Mexico is going to be coming around the corner. It'll be interesting to see. And I'm not saying it doesn't ever happen, but that's another point that we want to apply across. And I think that's putting this all in a nutshell. I just have a couple minutes left and maybe leave it to John for a few questions, but that's what's really been exciting for us, is having a background in biotech. Biotech's becoming a bigger part of this industry all the time. And now, as John mentioned, I've been a part of Athletes for Care for quite a while. If you don't know the group, you should, because it's a very great group, very solid. And if you've ever met a pro athlete, most of them are top-notch people. And I'm now chairman of the Scientific Advisory Council. So I'm putting together scientists from Uruguay, Spain, US, Israel, leading scientists from around the world, whether it's the endocannabinoid system or cannabis or even plant biology. There's a person we know that did some really interesting work using the Los Alamos supercomputers on cannabinoid molecules. So that's one last thing I wanted to end on. And John, if there's any questions, comments, I'd love to take them. Thank you.
Wow, lots of questions. And unfortunately, I have to wrap it up in the next minute or so. I just wanted to say that was an excellent walkthrough of the industry. And I find it ironic that if you're an American company, you have to list in Canada and then relist in the United States if you want to go anywhere. You know exactly what I'm talking about. For me, it's just absurd. And
that ain't right.
No, it definitely ain't right. And more importantly, I'm just imagining what it's going to be like when it's legal at the federal level, and finally everybody, all the mutual funds, all the pension funds, will not be precluded by the corporate governance from investing. And what that's going to mean. I mean, imagine Caliper sits down and says, we'll put 0.74% of our assets into the cannabis sector. You're talking billions. So fantastic. If anyone wants to get a hold of you, they obviously know how to reach you. And if not, you could post your contact information in the chat. And I just want to thank you for a most fascinating and highly informative presentation, Mr. David Traylor. Thank you again.
Thanks, John.
Okay.